On the morning of February 21st, 1991, there was nothing about the envelope that suggested it would matter. It was a plain white envelope, with no return address and no markings of urgency, arriving at the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency in Langley, Virginia, mixed in with dozens of routine deliveries that passed through the building every day. Inside, however, was a single sheet of paper that should never have existed. The message was short, typed on what appeared to be a manual typewriter, unsigned and unsupported by any evidence that could immediately be verified. It did not accuse anyone by name, it did not threaten, and it did not demand action. It simply stated 4 facts, delivered without emotion or explanation. There was a Soviet agent operating at a senior level inside the Directorate of Operations. He had been active for at least 6 years. He drove a Mercedes and had recently purchased a house in Great Falls using cash. Large cash deposits in 1985 and 1986 were worth examining. That was all. No rhetoric, no justification, and no attempt to persuade. The letter offered just enough detail to be dangerous because it suggested knowledge that only a very small number of people could possess. The envelope was opened by a junior officer in the Office of Security, someone trained to recognize when routine anomalies were no longer routine. Within minutes, the letter was removed from the mail system and carried by hand through secured corridors into offices where documents were rarely discussed outside carefully controlled channels. By 10:30 that morning, the letter was sitting on the desk of Sandra Grimes. Grimes was 47 years old and had spent nearly 25 years inside the agency. She had built her career on methodical analysis, documentation, and an almost stubborn refusal to accept coincidence as an explanation for complex failures. She read the letter carefully, then read it again, not because it was unclear, but because she understood exactly what it implied. If the letter was wrong, it was reckless, but if it was right, it meant the CIA had been bleeding internally for years without knowing where the wound was. Grimes made a copy for the file, stood up, and walked down the hall to show it to her colleague, Jean Vertefeuille. Between the two of them, they carried more institutional memory about failed Soviet operations than almost anyone still working in the building. They did not react with shock when they read the letter. They reacted with recognition, because for more than 5 years, they had been trying to explain a collapse that had no acceptable explanation. And this letter, anonymous and unexplained, was the first thing that pointed toward one.
Between 1985 and 1987, the CIA's Soviet operations did not deteriorate gradually. They collapsed. Assets who had provided reliable intelligence for years disappeared without warning. Dead drops went untouched. Scheduled meetings failed to occur. Entire intelligence networks went silent in a matter of months. At first, the losses were explained through familiar assumptions. The KGB might have improved its surveillance capabilities. CIA officers in Moscow might have been followed more effectively. Communication systems might have been compromised. Each explanation was investigated carefully, and each collapsed under scrutiny, leaving investigators with fewer answers and growing unease. The compromised operations did not rely on the same tradecraft. They did not use the same communications. They were not even managed by the same handlers. The only thing they shared was the outcome: arrest, interrogation, and in many cases, execution. By late 1985, the pattern could no longer be ignored. Some of the most valuable Soviet assets the CIA had ever recruited were gone, including senior military officers, intelligence professionals, and technical specialists with access to information the United States could not obtain by any other means. At least 10 major assets were lost in less than 2 years. Grimes and Vertefeuille were tasked with answering a question that few inside the agency wanted to ask aloud. How could an intelligence service with global reach lose this many assets this quickly without a single identifiable breach? They began the only place analysts ever can, with files. Every compromised operation was reviewed. Every cable was examined. Every operational report was compared against the others. Slowly, an uncomfortable pattern emerged. All of the exposed assets shared one critical detail. Their identities, or their existence, appeared in CIA documentation accessible to officers inside a specific part of the agency, the Soviet and East European Division of the Directorate of Operations. In the mid-1980s, roughly 200 people had access to those files, including case officers, reports officers, analysts, and support staff. It was a pool too large to accuse directly, but far too small to ignore. By 1987, the conclusion that no one wanted to articulate became unavoidable. This was not a technical failure or a surveillance failure. It was human. There was a mole inside the CIA, someone trusted, fully cleared, and positioned in such a way that they didn't need to break into the system because they were already part of it. For years, that realization had gone nowhere. There were no names, no proof, and no starting point that would allow a serious investigation to move forward without risking internal chaos. Until a plain white envelope arrived, carrying 4 sentences that did not accuse anyone directly, but narrowed the impossible into something specific enough to investigate. A senior officer with access, a luxury vehicle, a house purchased with cash, and unexplained deposits during the exact years the CIA's Soviet assets began to disappear. For the first time, the hunt was no longer abstract. It had a shape, and somewhere inside the building, the person described in that letter was still showing up to work every day.
The letter did not name anyone, but it did something far more consequential. It transformed an invisible threat into a finite problem. If the details were accurate, then the mole had to meet 3 conditions. He needed sustained access to sensitive Soviet operations. He needed unexplained wealth that began in 1985 or 1986, and he needed a lifestyle that could not be reconciled with a government salary alone. Grimes and Vertefil proceeded with extreme caution. They did not interview colleagues, alert senior leadership outside their immediate chain, or request bank records that could trigger rumors. Instead, they began in the quietest place available to them, the Office of Security. Every CIA officer with access to classified information was required to file annual financial disclosure forms. These documents were not designed to uncover espionage. They existed to flag conflicts of interest and obvious vulnerabilities. But sometimes patterns appear where systems were never intended to look. The 2 women reviewed disclosures from officers assigned to the Soviet and East European Division during the mid-1980s, focusing on real estate purchases, vehicle ownership, and changes over time. The phrase "house in Great Falls" immediately narrowed the field. Great Falls was an affluent suburb outside Washington, known for expensive properties and senior residence. Purchasing a house there with cash was not impossible, but it was rare enough to merit attention. Within days, the list contracted from hundreds to dozens. The final filter was more telling: large cash deposits. CIA salaries were deposited regularly and predictably. Officers did not receive sudden inflows of physical currency unless it came from outside the system. When Grimes aligned the years mentioned in the letter with career timelines, an unsettling overlap appeared. The same period when Soviet assets began disappearing was also the period when unexplained money began surfacing. Most explanations collapsed under scrutiny: inheritances that could not be verified, spouses with vague business interests, real estate transactions that made no financial sense. Then one name began to recur, not because it matched the letter perfectly, but because from that moment on, the investigation was no longer about a system failure, but about a colleague. His name was Aldrich Ames, known inside the agency as Rick. He had joined the CIA in 1962, at the height of the Cold War, and had spent most of his career focused on Soviet targets. His assignments took him to Turkey, New York, and Mexico City, before returning him to headquarters in the early 1980s. In 1983, Ames was assigned to the Counterintelligence Group within the Soviet and East European Division, one of the most sensitive positions in the agency. From that desk, he could see nearly everything: the identities of active assets, their communication methods, meeting schedules, and vulnerabilities. If someone inside the building was feeding information to Moscow, this was exactly the vantage point they would need. At first glance, Ames did not fit the letter precisely. He did not drive a Mercedes but a Jaguar, and he lived not in Great Falls but in Arlington, details that briefly made him seem like the wrong man. Then Grimes examined his financial disclosures. In 1989, Ames purchased a house in Arlington for more than $500,000, paid entirely in cash. That same year, he bought the Jaguar with cash and funded substantial home renovations the same way. At the time, his salary was roughly $60,000 a year. There was no plausible financial path from that income to that lifestyle. The explanation appeared in his paperwork. The money belonged to his wife, Rosario, a Colombian national he had met during his assignment in Mexico City. According to the disclosures, her family had substantial resources. On paper, the explanation was complete. In reality, it raised more questions than it answered. Because 1985 was not just the year Ames remarried, it was the year CIA assets began to vanish. As Grimes reviewed his personnel file, additional contradictions emerged. Ames had a long-documented problem with alcohol. He had been removed from at least one overseas assignment. His first marriage had collapsed under financial strain and drinking. None of these details made him a spy, but all of them made him vulnerable. Then came the detail that reframed everything. In April 1985, the same month the first Soviet arrests began, Ames had walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington. At the time, no one knew why, but if Ames was the mole, the CIA had not been penetrated from the outside. It had been betrayed deliberately, calmly, and for money by one of its own.
By the summer of 1991, suspicion had hardened into something far more dangerous. Grimes and Vertefiel no longer believed they were testing a hypothesis. They believed they were watching a man who had already destroyed years of intelligence work and who was still moving freely through the halls of Langley. Belief, however, was not enough. Accusing a CIA officer of espionage required evidence that could withstand courts, congressional scrutiny, and history. That meant the case had to move beyond the agency. Quietly, and without alerting almost anyone else, the file was handed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where a veteran counterintelligence team took over the investigation. Surveillance began slowly, with teams following Ames through Northern Virginia traffic, logging routes, detours, and subtle behaviors that suggested counter-surveillance awareness, while listening devices, phone monitoring, and bank subpoenas quietly built the financial picture. The financial evidence confirmed the letter's warning. Between 1985 and 1986, more than $1 million in cash entered Ames's accounts, deposited in carefully structured increments designed to avoid reporting thresholds. The deposits continued. By 1991, the unexplained total exceeded $2 million. Agents also observed classic tradecraft, including chalk marks placed on mailboxes, unexplained meetings, and travel that had paperwork but little operational justification. The most unsettling discovery was not any single act, but how normal everything else appeared. Ames still came to work, attended meetings, and held a security clearance. For months, the investigation advanced without confrontation. Because catching a spy is not about suspicion, but about patience. By late 1993, patience gave way to urgency. Surveillance indicated plans for international travel that raised alarms inside both agencies. If Ames reached Moscow, there was no guarantee he would return. The decision was made to end the hunt. In October 1993, while Ames was at work, agents conducted a covert search of his home. They found classified documents, notes describing clandestine meetings, and materials used for signaling and dead drops. Still, they waited, ensuring he was not part of a broader network. 4 months later, on the morning of February 21, 1994, exactly 3 years after the anonymous letter arrived, the wait ended. As Ames stepped out of his house in Arlington and approached his car, FBI vehicles blocked the driveway. The arrest was swift and controlled. There was no attempt to flee and no denial, only resignation. Within hours, the CIA was in crisis. Senior leadership was briefed. Damage assessments began immediately. Entire operational frameworks were frozen. During interrogation, the truth emerged. The betrayal had begun in April 1985 and had never stopped. The motivation was not ideology, but money. Millions of dollars had been exchanged for names, methods, and lives. More than 10 Soviet assets had been executed as a direct result.
more than 100 intelligence operations had been compromised. The arrest ended the investigation, but not the consequences. In the months that followed, the CIA conducted a damage assessment unlike any in its history. Files were re-examined, operations dismantled, and partners quietly notified. The conclusions were devastating. Entire tradecraft systems were rendered unusable, and relationships with allied services were damaged, some beyond repair. Beyond the numbers were the lives. Families were shattered, wives lost homes, children were expelled from schools, careers ended before they began. Some were told their fathers had died in accidents. Others learned the truth only years later, when archives opened and the lies collapsed. During interrogation, Ames described his actions in practical terms: debt, divorce, and a desire for a life he could not afford. When asked about the men who died because of his betrayal, he spoke of them not as people, but as abstractions. Dehumanization, more than anything else, allowed him to continue. Ames pleaded guilty in 1994, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Legal justice was served, but institutional scars remained. Reforms followed. Financial disclosures became stricter, polygraph examinations more frequent. Access to classified material was limited by necessity rather than rank, yet none of these changes could eliminate the fundamental vulnerability created by trust. And then there was the letter. 4 sentences, typed and unsigned, preserved in federal files. No one ever proved who wrote it. It may have been a colleague who noticed too much and feared professional ruin, or someone in Ames's personal life who decided silence was no longer acceptable. The truth was never established. What is known is this: without that letter, the investigation might never have begun. Without it, the betrayal might have continued, and the damage would have grown even worse. Espionage history remembers famous names and dramatic arrests, but sometimes the most important figure is the one who never appears on camera, never stands in court, and never claims credit. The letter did not expose a spy. It exposed how easily silence can become complicity.